everybody. We're really excited to be here in Prineville, so thank you for welcoming us, those of you who live in Crook County. It's great to be out of Bend and into the beautiful Crooked River. My name's Kate Fitzpatrick. I'm the executive director of the Deschutes River Conservancy. We have been doing some educational seminars on water for the last year and a half. I think this is our 14th, maybe, something like that. But it's our first time out in Prineville, so we're really excited to be here. Thank you. Just a note about the Deschutes River Conservancy for those of you who don't know us. We were formed in 1996 by the tribal interests in the basin, irrigation and environment interests. And our mission is to restore stream flow and water quality in the Deschutes, and that includes from the headwaters all the way to the Columbia, including all the tributaries and, of course, the Crooked River system as well. But what's unique about us is that we work through collaboration and consensus. So we only do projects that are win-win projects that benefit all the interests in the basin. We've been doing that for the last 27 years. What else? I'm gonna just tell a joke to get us started. So, what did the fish say when it hit its head? Someone said it. Damn! So I tell that joke because we're talking about the lower Crooked River system today, which is really driven by the dams that were built here, and we're going to hear a lot about the history of that and actually the multiple benefits that that system creates for the irrigated agriculture that you see here in the valley, as well as fish and wildlife, and City of Prineville water supply as well, along with, of course, recreation and just a beautiful river. So that's what our goal is, to talk about how that system is managed today. It's a really interesting story. I'm sure some of you in the audience are experts, and we have a great expert panel here that I'll introduce in a minute. I do want to acknowledge our sponsors that allow us to keep these seminars free for the public. So we have the City of Bend, Central Oregon Intergovernmental Council, Sun Country Tours, REMAX, and then last is the Roundhouse Foundation that has actually allowed us to have some funding to take the series on the road and come to places like Prineville. So without further ado, I will introduce our panel. First of all, our facilitator, Lisa Seals, on the end there. Lisa is a program manager at the DRC. She has a PhD in natural resource management, and she's been working on water issues in the Deschutes Basin for over a decade. So she will lead us through our evening tonight. Next to Lisa is Bill Nasham. To find Bill's information here. Bill is the Crooked River Water Master for the Oregon Water Resources Department. This is just the second year that the Crooked River has its own water master, and that is Bill. He's worked for the department for the last 8 years. He was born and raised in Yakima, went to Whitman College and Oregon State University. He likes to mountain bike, and he likes to cook, and his specialty is a stir fry. Next to Bill is Bruce Scanlon, who many of you, I would assume, know Bruce. Bruce is a hometown hero. He was born and raised in Prineville, Oregon, married his high school sweetheart. He has 2 adult children and one 2.5-year-old grandbaby named AJ. We're not going to talk about his esteemed football quarterback career, but he did maybe win states when he was in Crook County. He's too shy. And he thought the audience might actually have some more information about him if anybody wants to add. Okay, last but not least is Peter Lickwar, who is a fish and wildlife biologist for the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. He's been with the service for 32 years. He started working on projects in the Deschutes Basin in 1997 and has been working out of the Bend field office since 2002. His superpower is that he can hold his breath while underwater while hitting his head for at least 30 seconds. You might ask why. Peter's an avid kayaker. Situationally appropriate when you're in whitewater rapids. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Lisa, and we'll have a great night. We have food back there, and also sodas are free at the bar, and there's drinks you can buy as well. So we hope you have a great time.
All right. Thank you very much, Kate, and thank you all for being here. Just a quick show of hands. How many people have attended a previous Raise the Deschutes seminar? All right, there's a handful of you. Okay, how many of you are local to the Prineville Crooked River Basin area? All right. Wonderful. Fantastic. Well, welcome. We're happy to have you all here. Although I've been studying water management in the Deschutes Basin for over a decade, I am embarrassed to say that I have not focused my studies on the Crooked. So this whole process has been a learning journey for me, and I am going to learn right along with many of you tonight, and probably many of you in the audience know a lot more than I do. So without further ado, I think, one technical thing to get out of the way. We're gonna take questions at the end of the presentation. And so unless you all have a burning question or clarifying question, like we're talking about something that is just completely gone over your head, or we're using acronyms or abbreviations that you don't understand, we're just going to ask you to hold all the questions to the end. But if you are missing something vital, like start nodding or waving, and we'll make sure to clarify whatever it is that we're saying that got too wonky. We tend to sometimes go into water wonky language, but we're going to do our best to keep it as high level as possible tonight. So to start with, let's see. I'm just going to first slide. Here is a map of the lovely state of Oregon and the Deschutes Basin. And as many of you may know, the Deschutes Basin is the second largest river basin in the state. Does anybody know which the largest is? The Willamette. A panelist up here knows the answer. The Willamette is the largest basin. It is the basin just immediately to our west, and both drain to the Columbia. So the basin runs from south to north. This has confused the heck out of me for a decade, right? So when we say downriver, we're actually meaning up north. So downriver is up north. So going into this is getting a little bit more specific. So you can see the headwaters of the Deschutes Basin start technically at Little Lava Lake. That's the first surface water in the basin. Really, the Cascades are the headwaters of the Deschutes side of the basin, and the Ochocos are the headwaters on the Crooked. So we've got the overview with all of the streams in the Crooked River Basin, and we're going to hone in on the specifics of all this. So tonight, we're going to talk about the system itself. We're going to talk about agriculture in the basin and the history of that, how water is managed, and the Crooked River Act and the management of fish and wildlife. We're going to touch on a lot of different topics. So buckle up. We're going for a ride. So I like to start presentations with this map. I'm obsessed with this map, and this is going to pop back up later in the presentation. But this is a stream map, or a map that shows all of the surface water in the state of Oregon. And as you can see, Central Oregon is unique. This pointer. Oh, there it is. In that, what do you notice about this area of the state? There's not a lot of surface water, right? So, however, when you start to focus on the Crooked, which is the widest of the streams right in this general zone, you can see that there is a lot of surface water. So that's kind of one of the distinguishing characteristics between the upper Deschutes Basin and the Crooked River, and we're going to delve into that a little bit more. Geologically and hydrologically, they are very distinct. The Crooked River is, the upper Deschutes River is groundwater fed, so it's pretty stable, whereas the Crooked River is a more flashy stream. And flood control is important in this basin, where there is no other flood control anywhere else in the Deschutes Basin other than the Crooked. So prior to non-tribal settlement, this entire valley was a floodplain. So where we are right now was very, very wet. And I just learned that in January, the river right next to us would have had 10 times the flow of what we're seeing right now if it weren't for what we're going to talk about tonight with regard to the dams. So, and then I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that this basin is historically been in a very important part of the basin for tribes, because it was once a major spawning ground for anadromous fish. Perhaps as much as 50% of the anadromous fish in the basin hail from this area, and those fish are spring Chinook salmon, which have been most impacted by system changes over the last couple hundred years, which we're going to talk about tonight. Steelhead trout, and also Pacific lamprey. And then we also had non-migratory fish, such as red band trout and bull trout, so among others. So very important for the tribes. So without further ado, we're going to dive into the history of farming in Crook County. And Bruce, who is the manager of Ochoco Irrigation District, is going to talk about what things were like back starting in, I believe, the mid-1800s. Take.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm happy to see all of these familiar faces out here. Welcome to Prineville if you are from out of Prineville. I've got notes because I need this crutch, and so I'll just kind of walk through this and give us a little bit of a picture and a flavor for what Crooked River, the Crooked River Basin, what the Prineville Valley, and what we're known for, and how we came to be where we're at today. To begin with, agriculture started in Prineville in 1866, and the area was attractive to people because it was on the trail to the gold diggings over near John Day. And the creeks lay on the surface of the valley floors, and so what people would do is they would dig small ditches from the creeks out into the floodplain, and then they would farm those. They would sell produce or whatever to the gold miners as they would come across on their way to the diggings. By 1900, the area had grown to about 5,000 irrigated acres, and they were partially irrigated. Partially because the creeks ran high in the spring during the flood control season, like we're kind of seeing right now, and then they dried up by July, around July or so. But there were another 15,000 acres, as you can see around this basin, this area, that couldn't get any water, and hence they couldn't be farmed. Without some major improvements, the people knew that the local economy couldn't develop any further. It had reached its pinnacle, and so it needed more water to grow. Local boosters, the state of Oregon and the U.S. Reclamation Service, now the Bureau of Reclamation, studied the land and the water supply that was available to it, and they designed what was called the Ochoco project in 1914. A plan to irrigate 20,000 acres was developed, and the start of that was the Ochoco Dam itself, and off of Ochoco Creek, and they would pump water up to some of the bench lands. Since Reclamation was busy building huge projects around the west, like the Shoshone, the Klamath, and the Umatilla, they put the Ochoco project on the back burner. But the local economy was collapsing, and settlers that were desperate in the area, and so the Ochoco Irrigation District was formed in 1916. In February of 1916. $1.5 million in bonds was sold to irrigation investors, and that is what allowed the district to start the dam in 1918. The Ochoco Dam was constructed utilizing what was called zone earth-filled structure, and it was built with hydraulic fill methods, and you can see that big water cannon there down on the left shooting water up. Those large hydraulic water cannons were set up to wash soil and rock debris down into forms, and a system of flumes transported all that fill material down. You can see all the wood cribbing that was developed down on the sides there on the top right picture, and all that wood and everything is still present in the dam itself, in that earthen-filled dam. It was completed in 1920. The state of Oregon promised to pay the interest on the bonds for 5 years as a loan to the district. But in 1925, it was time to start paying back your loans, and that was a problem. The district couldn't do it. So farm receipts were far too low, and settlers were going bankrupt. What went wrong was the Ochoco Dam simply was big enough. It holds 44,000 acre-feet of water, but it only fills 1 out of every 4 years. Next one. Meanwhile, the Crooked River right over here, flowed through the valley untouched. And because it flooded in the spring, as you can see from these pictures, some of the years, Frank, you remember a couple of these? Yeah, okay. Okay. And then it dried up in the summer. And only a huge undertaking could tame that flow and lead the water onto the good land that was available to it. People could only dream about the Crooked River and could do for the valley. The same story was kind of being played out in other areas in the basin as well. The Tumalo, Central Oregon, and Arnold projects were also bankrupt due to poor financing and overly optimistic water supply projections. Then came the Depression. In 1933, the federal government bought up the Ochoco bonds at 20 cents on the dollar, and they shrank the district from the 20,000 acres to 8,500 acres. I'm glad I wasn't on the manager that had to tell you you don't have water anymore. And the state wrote off the district's $400,000 debt. But by 1935, Congress realized that putting more effort into reclamation and it could boost the whole country's economy. So reclamation, at the urging of the local and state officials, came back to Crook County and dusted off some old plans for storing water on the Crooked River. And they reported back to Congress that something good could be done here. But all of that was put on hold because of the war. After the war, people urged reclamation to come back again and help, and Congress agreed to rehabilitate Ochoco Dam in 1949 at a cost of $500,000 to the district. And local and state officials such as Judge Arthur Bowman, Senator Wayne Morse, and LaSalle Coles, the district manager, urged Congress to build out what the plans were that they had laid out before the war. And in 1956, Congress agreed, and the Crooked River Project was born. The plans called for a 150-plus acre-foot reservoir for irrigation and flood control purposes, and an 8.3-mile diversion canal, a 16-mile distribution canal, and a bunch of pumping plants, and the total estimated at $10 million for the project. This was a scary time for local people because for the project to go forward, they'd have to pledge their property as collateral to secure the government loan that they needed. They could lose everything if the project failed. LaSalle Coles and the Irrigation District would have to promise to guide the local project for the future. And a little irrigation district that used to distribute water by horseback would have to become skilled in electricity, in huge pumps, welding, heavy equipment operation and maintenance, and complex finances. The district's users voted in favor, and the irrigators of the valley signed a 50-year repayment contract and dreamed of the day that water would arrive. A local family, the Hudspeths, formed Keystone Construction Company, and they bid on and won the contract for construction of Prineville Dam. It was Prineville Dam at the time. It turned into Bowman Dam, and they named it after Judge Bowman. Construction began in October of 1958, and the dam started storing water in December of 1961. Other contracts were let for the canals, the pumping plants, et cetera. At final build-out, Ochoco Irrigation District received a firm water supply for their 20,000 acres. Irrigators outside of the district also secured some water for 5,300 acres. And for over 60 years, the Prineville Valley has not suffered a major flood from the Crooked River. Before the dam, devastating floods, as we showed you earlier, in the valley were common, with portions of Prineville going underwater every 2 to 3 years. In December of 1964, during the largest flood ever known to the Northwest, Bowman Dam and Prineville Reservoir performed superbly. The floodwaters were stored and carefully released by the flood as it passed. And while all the creeks flowing into the valley went over their banks, the Crooked River remained safely within its banks. Not bad for a brand new reservoir that took it on.
It was a big test.
Yeah. Next one is this wasn't done for free. The district signed contracts with the federal government and to pay back their share of the project cost. Total cost was over $10 million. And to date, the district has paid back its obligation in full for that original project. The district is still paying on safety of dams repayments, though. Farmers outside of the district also have repayment contracts that they are currently still paying back. The public benefits, such as flood control and all the recreation benefits, have been paid out of the general registry.
Right. So over 100 years, we went from small irrigating, very small projects, basically not even a project, very, very small amounts of ag in the basin. Nope, no worries. To building Ochoco in the early 1900s, to a major reclamation project that was built in the mid 1900s and really changed the face of the valley and provides flood control. So many people's homes are not underwater, including where we are right now, which could be very, very wet if things were different. So, all right. And now I think we're going to move forward and talk a little bit about where we are today and Ochoco Irrigation District and the infrastructure that they are currently managing. Again, going from that really small irrigation district to one that had to manage lots and lots of large infrastructure.
Yeah, so here's a map of the irrigation district with the boundary in yellow. All of the green within that boundary is due to the delivery of irrigation water out of both Ochoco and Prineville reservoirs. We don't have any wells. There's no groundwater that we deliver. Everything is surface water provided. The shaded part at the top is the Mackay lands that we'll talk more about here after a while. So OID owns and operates Ochoco Dam, and then we operate Bowman Dam under contract with the Bureau of Reclamation. The irrigation district conveys water through about 120 miles of canals, pipelines, and ditches that we have to operate and maintain. The pumping stations that we have over 30 pumps that we operate and maintain. The water comes in at the ground level, and then we have to lift it to the bench lands. And so there's water within our district that is lifted 2 to 3, 4 times to get to certain portions of the irrigated agricultural areas. We have been servicing and maintaining this entire infrastructure for over 108 years now. And we serve nearly 900 patrons with just over 20,000 irrigated acres within the boundaries of the irrigation district.
That's a far cry from the 5,000 acres that were initially irrigated in the valley with what was available seasonally and with the creeks. So yes, 15,000 acres then are getting water that wouldn't have gotten it otherwise. Okay, well, with that, I think we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the geology of the basin and how water is managed. So this is an overview of the irrigated lands. The colors are a little funky for me, but the area right around Prineville is the area that Bruce has been talking about, which is Ochoco Irrigation District. The greenish color down south is Central Oregon Irrigation District, and although it's part of the Crooked River Basin, Bill is going to talk about why it is not irrigated with Crooked River water, and nor is the little blue area just near Smith Rock. So, Bill, do you want to tell us a little bit about the difference between the actual basin from hydrologic perspective versus what you, I think, refer to as the administrative basin from the Oregon Water Resources Department perspective?
Hello, can you hear me? Hi, I'm Bill. Thank you very much, Lisa. So the Crooked River Basin was carved out of the Deschutes Basin 2 years ago for administrative purposes, just due to the overwhelming issues that were going on in both basins, and the water resources split out the Crooked River. And so I was lucky enough to be chosen as the water master for the first year and the lowest water year on record last year. That was fun. But anyway, when the state carves out water master districts, they're in drainage basins, and we try to manage them as drainage basins. In our case here in Central Oregon, the irrigated acres, we actually irrigate Crooked Basin areas with Deschutes water. And this is the Powell Butte area, and this is all served by Central Oregon Irrigation District, and it's diverted in downtown Bend, okay? And then Lisa was talking about the blue area. That's also Deschutes water, and that's the Lone Pine District. So we've carved out the edge of the administrative basin is basically runs right alongside the Crooked River and stops right at the North Unit pumps. We can discuss that a little bit later, and then just basically encompasses the rest of the basin. So let's talk about a little bit about the geology of the basin. When we talk about the Deschutes Basin, you hear a lot that, hey, the Deschutes Basin is an infiltration basin. What I mean by an infiltration basin is as we've discussed, when precipitation falls, if you have young, porous volcanics and sediments, those tend to not hold the water at the surface, but yet promote infiltration. And so we have basically a groundwater system in the Deschutes Basin from basically actually a little bit west of the Cascade Crest, all the way down to the edge of this purple area, okay? And that whole region right here, and I'm outlining it with the cursor, that is all Deschutes Formation. And those are much younger. Those deposits are anywhere between recent, up to about 10 million years old. Then as we get to, and those are lavas that erupted from various volcanic centers throughout the basin on the west side, okay? Then as we get older, these lavas that we just talked about in the Deschutes Basin, they overlap much older deposits that we call the John Day and Clarno Formation. And those deposits range anywhere from, I want to say, 10 to over 23 million years old. Now, the Clarno is the oldest. And those deposits are also volcanics, but because they're so old, they've undergone a lot of weathering. And anytime you weather a mineral or a rock, it breaks down into smaller parts. And those smaller parts and particles become very tightly packed in a deposit, and they don't promote infiltration of the water, okay? So what you end up with is a very impermeable formation of the John Day. And so now we've got basically soils that promote surface runoff. They don't like infiltration, right? And in the John Day, and we're contrasted with the overlying deposits over here of the Deschutes Formation. And a good example of that here is this is kind of a schematic cross-section, and you have the younger volcanics of the Deschutes Formation, and this is kind of a schematic for groundwater as well. And then down below you have the older John Day volcanics. And a good example of this, I don't know if you guys make it to Smith Rock very often or have looked at the rocks closely, but where you park at Smith Rock at the parking lot, you're parking on Deschutes lavas, okay? That's a basalt flow, and that basalt flow was flowing northward, and it intersected, and it basically pushed the Crooked River northward up against a pre-existing topographic high, which was what? Smith Rock. Smith Rock is a volcanic plug in the John Day Formation. So it was a mountain. It was a topographic high in this plain. And the lava, the Deschutes flow, actually pushed the Crooked River up against Smith Rock. And that's why when you get out of your car, you're on basalt, and then you walk down the hill, cross the river, and you're in the John Day Formation. So that's a good representative example of what the geology is in our basin. Did I miss anything? So in general, we have percolation, groundwater controlled basin, lots of springs that feed all of basically the Deschutes, the main stem of the Deschutes River. Over here in the Crooked, we've got very impermeable soils, so we depend on runoff. We are a runoff system, and that has pros and cons. One of the pros, we can fill a reservoir very quickly, and a con would be that it can dry up very quickly. All right, next slide.
It also greatly explains this map that we looked at. You just did a great explanation of it. Why we have that big dark area in the middle is those younger lava flows that are super permeable, and so you don't get the runoff in that area.
So this does not represent the lack of water. It just represents the lack of water on the ground surface.
Yeah, surface water.
Yep.
Yep.
Oh, that's me now, huh? I'm controlling this thing. Okay, so here we're going back into the main basin. This goes all the way up here. Here's Paulina. And then this is our South Fork gauge. This is the South Fork of the Crooked River. These are black dots, are all gauges that Oregon Water Resources manages, and these are near real-time gauges. So you can see all of these gauges online and the 15-minute flows. So they're reporting online every 15 minutes, and you can see the flows at each one of these locations. Just to locate you, that's Big Summit Prairie right here. This is the North Fork of the Crooked River. Whoops. And then in the periphery out here, we've got the Ochoco gauge. So this is the gauge that measures the inflow into Ochoco Reservoir. Here's the gauge. This is on Mill Creek. This measures what we're getting out of the forest, and we're getting into distributing the water for irrigation and other purposes. And then here's Mackay right here, and our gauge right at the Forest Service boundary. Did you want to add something?
Go right ahead. Moving on in. We're focusing in. So this is the area that was on the map.
So now we're going to zoom in. Just to orient you, here's Bowman Dam, and you can see we have a gauge. We call it PRVO. This is also online. There's another one of these gauges that are online. This gauge tells you what Bruce and OID and the Bureau have determined what needs to be released out of Prineville Reservoir. The releases go down the main canyon, and these dashed lines are diversion canals, and I don't have the crooked feed on here, but the crooked feed is right there, but I don't have actually the dashed line for the crooked feed, but it runs right alongside the river right through there. And we also have a gauge on the crooked feed, as well as Baldwin Ditch, which serves mainly the White Deer Ranch. As you go farther north, we get into town. We have a gauge right there. It's right literally like less than 200 yards away. And that is what we call CAPO, or the gauge at Prineville. And we also have another diversion, Peoples Canal, which actually diverts right here, but most of that water is all delivered below Prineville. A little quick note too, you can see the data centers here. And at some point, if you guys have questions, I don't know that I've left a lot of time for it, but this is where we have what we call an aquifer storage and recharge project. It's a really slick project that's being undertaken in conjunction with the city, and that's going on right through here. So we'll just go to the next slide. So this next slide is below Prineville. Here, to orient you, here's that same CAPO gauge just right over here, about 100 yards away. We have the data centers. Here's the Peoples Canal that we were discussing, that's delivering water to basically all of the fields on the south side of the river. So OID basically delivers water on the north side, and Peoples, in conjunction with a few other diversions, Crooked River Central, as well as Lowline, and are all delivering water to the patrons on the south side of the river, who are not in the district. Also of real interesting note, this is the end of the COI Canal through here, and this is Dry River. Okay, and we've spoke about Dry River earlier in the talk. This is the continuation. This is the mouth of Dry River, and Dry River is you basically parallel on heading out on Highway 20 east of Bend.
I'll just I'll just note that that CO canal is the canal that diverts water from the Deschutes River in Bend and travels all the way out, irrigating that whole area in the Powell Butte area that you saw on the map, the green cross-hatching that's just south of the Crooked River. So technically in the basin, but not administratively served by water in the basin.
Yeah, exactly. And the slopes here, it's delivered here, and this is all downhill to the west. And so Dry River actually catches the excess or the runoff of the system, and hopefully it's not much, but it ends up down here in portions of the Crooked River. We also have a gauge here. We're going to be putting a new gauge in here at O'Neill where we can determine what flows we have coming out of this system. We need to know what we've got coming out of it. Before we have pumps here, NUID, North Unit Irrigation, actually takes Crooked River water and they pump it and they lift it. I'm not sure how far they lift that. 150, 200 feet at least? 150?
150 feet.
Yeah, they lift it 150 feet out of the Crooked River Canyon and it goes into the aqueduct of the North Unit Irrigation Canal that crosses the river there and then proceeds through a tunnel through Smith Rock. And those are delivered to the Crooked Lands.
No big feet there. 150 feet up and through a mountain to deliver water to the pink area on the map that we saw earlier that was up in the corner.
And then a last little thing on this slide, just to talk back to geology, you can see the topographic high of Smith Rock. It's a volcanic plug and a volcanic center, and then you see the subdued topography of the Deschutes Formation lavas that are relatively flat, for relatively speaking, to the south. So to change gears a little bit for the fun part. So what you're looking at, and this is kind of a complicated slide, and I'm going to go through in detail this particular slide, and then we'll pop through a bunch of other ones. But I want to talk about a few main things. So let's just focus on one line at a time. So on the left, you have the storage in acre feet, 1,000 acre feet, okay? We're looking at the storage of Prineville Reservoir, okay? And then over here on the right, you have reservoir flows, okay? That is CFS. That's the volume of water coming into the reservoir and also its volume of water coming out, okay? So that axis is measuring that. And time is down on the bottom, okay? Up at the top, this purple line is basically the maximum fill volume of Prineville Reservoir, okay? Approximately 148,000 acre feet, maybe plus or a little bit more than that. The next line I want to bring your attention to is this dashed red line, this dotted red line. And that dotted red line is what we call a fill curve. And it's the restrictive curve. It's the restriction on how full we can have that reservoir over certain periods of the year. And as we've talked about previously, we've got one of the biggest benefits of having this dam behind us in this community is flood control. And we deal with a very low, we're restricted to not have a lot of water, a pool in the reservoir over the course, in the winter period. And that's because we need to make room for what just happened in January this year. And this is a curve from January this year, and this past is the curve from January. This is a projected. And so the blue line is what the flow at post is. So that's the flow coming into Prineville Reservoir, okay? That's the volume, and that's measured over here. So we've got, 3,000 CFS coming in, plus or minus, okay? Last January, we had flows of 5,000 CFS at post, okay? So because we were well below the curve back over here, and then when we got the flows, we had to do flood control in the middle of January, and that's what this orange line is. And the orange line is what the water or the volume or the rate in which we had to release the water out of Bowman Dam to accommodate to keep us below this fill curve. And the black line, that's the actual volume that's in the reservoir. So This is all speculative over here, and everything to the left in the shaded area is actually what's just happened. Okay, so we're speculating to the right, where this is what happened to the left. So this is kind of a normal future. So when we say a normal future, that's this up here, normal future, we go, okay, we expect normal weather conditions with a runoff in the spring, right, when the snow melts. And when the snow melts, we're going to have to ultimately bump up the outflows of Bowman to accommodate those high inflows, just so we don't pop up way over the top of the reservoir. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah.
Can I just underscore? So we all know dams and reservoirs get built for a variety of different purposes, right? And unlike the other reservoirs in the Deschutes Basin on the Deschutes side of things, flood control is a critical piece, obviously, of this both the reservoirs in this basin. So what we're looking at, and all the wonderful explanation that Bill has given us, is just essentially trying to manage for both flood, making sure that there's enough storage in that reservoir to offset any floodwaters that might be coming in and keep everybody dry and keep us dry literally in this room, with also filling the reservoir so that there's enough water in it for irrigation and for fish and wildlife, which we're going to talk about going forward. So it literally is a balancing act. I mean, that is the two lines of trying to balance the blue line and the orange line, to make sure that both of those needs get met, or all those needs get met, I should say.
It's. I just want to interject that most of this all happens behind the scenes, right? Nobody else knows about what's going on. But when you look at what happens on the far, far left there with inflows over 5,000 CFS coming in, and the black line, yes, we are way above the flood curve at that time. And the reason why we went way above the flood curve is to capture all of that water, store it, and then release it slowly so that we don't flood it out. And nobody already knows that we've already mitigated for a flood here in Prineville just because we have that dam and it's functioned correctly. We've now brought it back down so that the reservoir elevation is underneath the flood curve, and we're going to chase that flood curve back up to fill the reservoir in hopes that we'll crest right at the top of that dam and won't have to do too much actions. But if there's a normal if we have a normal scenario here of runoff and snow, all of those different orange lines going up and down, that's all changes on the reservoir, and it's a very active, very dynamic process that is quite stressful for all of the individuals that sit on those calls that have to make those decisions to pretend like we know what we're doing.
It's the opposite of set it and forget it. It's like everybody paying attention all the time to make sure that we are meeting the needs of flood control, but also storing enough water for the summer to come. So it's a balancing act.
Yeah, thanks, you guys. Before I leave this slide real quick, I wanted to talk about, so during the season, our seasonal releases to meet irrigation demands and fish demands is last year roughly runs around 250 CFS out of the dam during the season. There are, and as also another thing I wanted to point out, you can see where you see the step progression of the drawdown of the releases. You see how it's stepped like that, rather than just a straight line, turn it off. That's so we don't strand fish, frankly, and we do that in the Bureau, and Bruce does that in coordination with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and ODF&W. Okay, so just quickly, now we're looking at a dry future. Okay, so we have the same left-hand side in the shading of what we've accomplished already, and then this is, okay, not a lot of snowpack and really not a lot of runoff, but yet we still had a little bit of runoff because we were close to the curve, right? You see that? And so we get a spike in the inflow, and this comes up. And then as you see the orange line right below me, the orange comes up and it flattens out because we're releasing water to compensate. And then we stop releasing water, and then we fill it to the brim. This right here, signature, is a signature of fish flows, and Peter will talk about those fish flows that we conduct over the course of the season.
All right. No, I keep going.
Wet future, just kind of the same scenarios, but in this case, we're seeing a lot more water in Prineville, as you can see. You get tons of water, lots of releases here. We're up here at 2,500 CFS, so that's nearly what we were doing last year. So,
All right. So this is just the beginning of some of the things that are going into deciding what's
Yep.
going on with releases. Next, I think we're going to move into. Are you going backwards?
oh, I am. Oops.
We're going to move into talking about the Crooked River Act, which passed in 2014 and shifted things around a little bit and gave us a new pot of water, the Fish and Wildlife Reservoir Storage Account, which Peter's going to talk about in just a minute. But Bill or Bruce, do you want to talk about the first fill contracted water? You can see our little schematic, that wavy line up there, and all the different pots of water below it.
So when the dam was built, there were contract holders who were all a part of the whole operation during the construction of Prineville Dam. Ochoco Irrigation District was the principal contract holder. There are other contract holders along Quail Valley, White Deer, and there's several contract holders below Prineville. Okay, that's all a part of the 68,000 acre feet. The act, additional waters were known to be needed, 5,100 acre feet for Prineville's, and that's mitigation water for Prineville's municipal water. So that's kind of a mitigation. They offset their pumping, the groundwater, with the surface water, okay? So that 5,100 acre feet is the mitigation water for the city of Prineville. This 2,700 acre feet, that is the Mackay Switch water. So we talked briefly about the Mackay Switch. They're going to pull all of the users, the live flow users, out of Mackay Creek, and they will be now served by Ochoco Irrigation District with pressurized water, and it'll be Crooked River water. And that Crooked River water is the 2,700 acre feet bucket. That's what that's for. And then North Unit contracts, because they do have Crooked River lands, and they contract for 10,000 acre feet every year on a yearly basis. So when the act came out, they added all those up. Go ahead. And then the main thing for the act was the designation of all of the rest. We've talked about, Prineville Reservoir is 150 plus or minus 1,000 acre feet. So we're only using a portion of it. So the rest of the account was designated during the Crooked River Act for fish and wildlife. And Bruce can probably expand on some of the other things they actually did in the act.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about the act? You got some more things?
Yeah,
to
I'll
add?
just briefly say, prior to the 2014 legislation, the entire facility was for irrigation and flood control, right?
Yeah.
And so even though not all of the water was allocated for it, it was all for irrigation purposes, and we managed it as such. And there was always a whole bunch of water that's carried over from year to year, but if there was a bad year, you always knew that you had a buffer there. But in the 2014 legislation, the stakeholders decided to try to provide some assurances for those individuals that have contracts for water in the facility, who are responsible for building it and making it happen. And that's why you get that first fill bucket. It's a unique way of looking at a reservoir. Most reservoirs don't fill this way, but all of those individuals that have contracts that are in that first fill bucket, the water goes to them equally as it gets to that first fill line. So until you get about that 86,000 acre feet line, it all goes to those contract holders that have irrigation water rights for that stored water that's in there. But then in 2014, the entities decided to devote the additional water that was not contracted to be utilized by the Bureau of Reclamation under consultation with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA, ODFW, those entities that have information to guide the use of that water in the basin to help. Other things that the act did was prior to 2014, the contract holders could not put water in stream as a beneficial use of that water because it was stored for irrigation only purposes. But the act allowed for OID and the others to put water in stream as a beneficial use, which was another benefit. It also moved the wilderness scenic boundary so that a hydro plant could be put on there. There's a number of individuals things, and I'll talk more about them in Kai Switch later.
Okay, thank you, Bruce. Yeah, and this gets back to the point that, all reservoirs have intended uses. And just like Bruce said, originally flood control and irrigation were the uses. And so the Crooked River Act shifted things around to allow for some of that water to go to benefit fish and wildlife. And so without further ado, we're going to ask Peter to talk about this. And again, this is the Fish and Wildlife Reservoir Storage Account is on top of the contracted first fill. So all those contract holders in the lower, that all fills up before we get to the Fish and Wildlife part of the reservoir. So you need a full reservoir to make that happen. Did you want the... So specifically, which species, when you're thinking about managing that water, which species are you managing for?
Actually, I'm not supposed to hold it at the bottom. Is this working? Okay.
Yep.
You're welcome. Thank you, Wade. I actually wanted to back up because it struck me that before we started to talk about Fish and Wildlife and the 2014 Act, there were a variety of other acts and agreements that provide additional context into how we make recommendations for fish and wildlife flows in the Crooked. So certainly the 1956 Act that created Bowman Dam established what, I don't want to speak for reclamation, but I think it's safe to say, is the preeminent priority in flow management, which is flood control to protect human life and property. So there's a variety of other things that happen subsequently regarding flow management, but Greg, I think I'm safe to say that that never changed the fact that flood control is the priority in managing flows.
Yep.
Fair enough?
Yep.
So when you hear about all these other things for managing flows for fish and wildlife, it's against the background of the preeminent priority of flood control. So after 1956, things proceeded. A variety of things happened regarding flows, but nothing particularly huge. And one of the things that happened in 2005 was the Pelton Round Butte Hydro Project on the Deschutes, Portland General Electric's 3-dam project, was relicensed by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And one of the requirements of their new license was anadromous reintroduction to reestablish self-sustaining populations of sockeye, steelhead, and spring chinook in about 150 miles of basin upstream of the dams. And of course, that included the Crooked River. And anadromous reintroduction actually began in 2009 when all the necessary facilities were completed. And the fish you're looking at went into the water in 2009 as a 1-inch long fry and had extraordinary good luck and actually survived to grow to 24 inches and return to the Pelton Round Butte dams to be passed upstream to spawn naturally in the tributary of its choice. And I believe Jim named this fish Lucky. It was just entirely appropriate. In addition to the anadromous reintroduction, for which created a kind of a additional priority for flow management, in 2012, the DRC and North Unit Irrigation District reached an agreement, I believe they call it the North Unit DRC Water Supply Agreement, to help maintain flows downstream of the North Unit pumps. And Kate Fitzpatrick is here and can explain all about that agreement. So that was an agreement that helped set fish and wildlife flows downstream of North Unit's pumps. Then in 2014, everything went cattywampus because they passed the 2014 Crooked River Act. which kind of changed the whole background that the water supply agreement had been established on. Kate, is that accurate? True. Good. So sorry about that, Kate. And so suddenly, in 2014, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Service, to our surprise, found out that we had management and recommendation duties for the approximately 62,000 acre feet of uncontracted storage that graphic showed on top of the 86,113 acre feet of contracted storage. And as was very accurately pointed out, we make recommendations. Bureau of Reclamation decides whether to accept those recommendations and whether or not there are aspects of a recommendation that they might deem feasible or appropriate. And I don't think we've had maybe one or two small occasions where we had to maybe reconsider some aspects of our recommendation. 2019, which we'll get to in a minute, Opal Springs Hydro Project at River Mile 8 on the Crooked, just about 0.8 miles upstream of the Lake Billy Chinook arm of the Crooked River, got fish passage, which it had not had since 1986. So now these fish, Nasham species that had been reintroduced beginning in 2009, had volitional passage past this previously impassable dam and could migrate freely upstream into the Crooked River Basin. As well, it also improved some of our downstream passage. So that was another very important event in the overall context of this. Then, in 2020, we finalized the Deschutes Habitat Conservation Plan with the 7 districts of the Deschutes Basin Board of Control in the city of Prineville. So this established yet another set of agreements and understandings about flow management. So it has gotten a little more complex as the years have passed, but it has also created greater opportunities. And we're very, very proud and happy with how Reclamation has been willing to work with us in the face of all these things to help manage their top priorities of flood control and irrigation fill, while also trying to help maintain flows for both the blue ribbon, rainbow red band fishery below the dam and the anadromous reintroduction. So it just felt like I had to provide you a little context with everything that's there that we have to work with every year in managing flows for fish and wildlife in the Crooked.
Definitely. So if you think about the graphs with all the lines, just think about a lot more lines being added to the graph that has to be thought about as we're making management decisions about how much water gets released.
Boy, I think that's enough for the moment. I would just add that the 2014 Act was more general in its directive to manage flows for fish and wildlife resources. However, the 2020 Habitat Conservation Plan, and by the way, National Marine Fisheries has established their own habitat conservation plan with the DBBC in 2022. The 2020 HCP for the Crooked River and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was focused on bull trout. That was the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's listed species in the basin. NIMS has regulatory authority under the ESA for steelhead in the Crooked. So you've got 2 HCPs which are fundamentally identical, even though they are targeted at different species. So it just gets better and better. Checking my notes.
Can I steal the clicker so I can show some pictures of some of the things that we've been talking about?
Sorry about fish. Okay, so there's Lucky.
we have some beautiful pictures of fish, all of the species that we've been talking about that we are focused on managing for.
And that are right out there.
So reintroduced Chinook,
Yep, spring Chinook, also a very important tribal species.
very important.
Bull trout, which is ESA threatened. I believe it was designated back in 1999. Those of you who fish in the Metolius and Lake Billy Chinook may have hooked one. They are a lot of fun to hook.
Not anadromous, though.
Not well, they are anadromous in. Well, no, I don't want to
Okay.
get into that.
Don't-
That's
Never mind,
that's-
scratch that.
that's Dolly Varden. Anyways, yeah, we won't get into all that.
Quick note.
Yes.
Am I on? Quick note, if you guys didn't think they made it up this far, I was measuring right below Bowman Dam, standing in the river, and a Chinook parked right next to my foot for about 20 minutes. Literally just it spawned out, but it was there.
Bill
That's
sent
pretty
me
cool.
a picture and he
I sent him
said,
pictures.
"What is this?" I said, "I'm pretty sure it's a spring Chinook, Bill." So it
Fantastic.
is absolutely remarkable. They utilize the entirety of the Crooked now that there's volitional passage at Opal, as well as perhaps entering Mackay and Ochoco creeks. Red band, that's the fish people are usually angling for in the Blue Ribbon section downstream of Bowman Dam during the summer. And of course, steelhead. Looks like a happy fisherman someplace on Lower Deschutes. Deschutes HCP, we'd already mentioned that a little bit. It is a 30-year permit, and we began in 2020, and this will remain in place until 2050. And the covered species for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's HCP were two, Oregon spotted frogs, which are not in the Crooked. That would be a complicating factor. But are present extensively through the upper Deschutes and are present both in Wickiup and Crane Prairie, two very important irrigation reservoirs. And as I mentioned, NIMS completed their HCP in 2022, and it covered mid-Columbia steelhead and sockeye. Sockeye are not a listed species, but they're anadromous.
You want me to take this one?
Oh, sure.
I sort of insisted on throwing this in here,
dive right in.
not to describe all of the life cycles of the various fish on here, but just again thinking back to the graphs that Bill that Bill showed with the fill lines of the reservoir and trying to manage for flood control and irrigation, and now we're layering on multiple different species, not just these three, but others as well, and their various life cycles and when they need water and where they need water. And then these guys all get together and talk about how to manage manage the reservoirs and the river accordingly. So it's definitely the opposite of set it and forget it for everybody involved in managing this.
Yeah, we do have a variety of species, and we are trying to manage for all of them as well as we can, both to create fishing opportunities for local anglers and to support the anadromous reintroduction. But it is a challenge every year. And as regards the uncontracted storage, I did want to note that after the first fill of 86,113 acre feet, the reservoir can fill up to 148,633 acre feet. So in a full year, the Fish and Wildlife the Fish and Wildlife storage account has 62,000 acre feet in it, which is great. We can do a lot of great things with that. And also the City of Prineville 5,100 acre feet is also available for management under Fish and Wildlife. So in full years, which used to happen 7 out of 10, but maybe not quite so much, we had abundant water, and we were able to utilize it for significant fish and wildlife benefits and still carry over 20 to 30,000 acre feet of that fish and wildlife storage account for next year, subsequent years. 2022, as Bill mentioned, we did not fill the reservoir. And in fact, what did it fill to? 42,000? What was it? 42,000 acre feet. Missed first fill of 86,000 by 40,000 acre feet. Fish and wildlife uncontracted storage was 0. That's not much to work with. And it was quite a quandary. And the 5,100 acre foot account that we could also manage for fish and wildlife only partially filled to, 4,200 acre feet or something. So the Crooked River Act does a good job of providing storage for fish and wildlife flows in a lot of years. But as we saw back in 2022, it could be problematic in years where we have very little fish and wildlife storage to work with, or even 0. So it's got more an element of complexity.
All right, let's show those last few pictures of Opal Springs Fish Passage, which,
There we go.
so this is the above version.
So if you look, is this one with the spotlight?
Here, I got.
It's the top. Oh, it's the top one. Okay, I can do this. So there's the fish ladder that was built in 2019. Previously, there was no passage at the dam, although for several years we did build a temporary fish trap over here next to this abutment, which we were able to collect spring chinook and steelhead and manually pass them over the dams. Now we have fully volitional fish passage.
And they're using it, which is
And
fantastic.
they're using it. If I remember correctly, after the fish ladder became operational in November of 2019, I think we had the first steelhead enter the ladder 2 days after it was constructed.
Wow.
I mean, it's
That's
just
amazing.
absolutely remarkable. And they don't have periscopes. They're not getting to stick their heads above the water and look for a fish ladder. So it's just amazing that they find these things.
There's another view of the ladder.
There you go. Yep.
So now in the interest of time, I'm going to move us on. So we've talked a lot about where we've been and how this all comes together. We're going to just spend a very few minutes talking about the future, because there are some big projects afoot in the Crooked River Basin, and we would be remiss if we did not mention those. And some of them have already been sort of touched upon, but we're just going to kind of quickly talk about Ochoco Irrigation District's modernization projects that are underway right now. So without further ado, Bruce, I'm going to let you kind of walk through at a high level what is going on in the district right now.
Yeah, the irrigation district, am I on?
Yep.
Sort of. It has completed a watershed, a watershed plan EA, and is presently utilizing federal funds through the PL 566 program to complete a series of projects that we have in the works. This is a schematic of the irrigation district. Starting down at the very bottom is our main diversion, and going due north, you'll see we have a series of things that we need to put into place to complete our watershed plan and fulfill our ultimate goal of completing the Mackay switch. The things we have to do are, we have some modifications to make to the diversion canal to increase the additional water that we need to deliver from Prineville Reservoir to the irrigators on Mackay Creek. Right now, some of you have seen a pump station that is being built in downtown. That new pump station is the first lift that has to be done to raise that water to the next level up there through the Iron Horse section. And there's a section right here in the middle that's got two different colors. There's a red and there's a yellow. The red is the old canal, and we're going to realign that, shorten it up, and work with the city to put all that in pipe through that section. That should start next year. So we're doing pump station number 1 here, the arrow. Ochoco, and then we'll do the green Iron Horse section next year. Then hopefully in the following year, we'll do Crooked River Pump Station number 2, which is another large pump station. They have to lift that water again to get into the Ochoco main canal. We have to do some work on the Ochoco main canal before we can get it up to the new area where the Mackay pump station will be. We're going to call it the Cox Pump Station in honor of J.B. Cox, the farmer in the area. And then there's 6 miles of pipeline that goes up the Mackay Creek area. So in satellite view, you can see that we have a whole bunch of stuff over many, many miles that has to be managed and dealt with and lift that water multiple times. The goal, the ultimate objective here is to take the water that has been allocated within Prineville Reservoir and lift it and ferry it to the point where we can pump it and deliver it to new patrons on Mackay Creek. Those individuals currently divert water out of Mackay Creek. They take the live flow water that's there in the spring, usually dries up by July, and they put it on their lands, a lot of them through flood irrigation and some sprinkle. What we will be providing to them is a more secure source of water by having stored water. That water is available to them most years from April all the way till October. That water would be delivered through a pressurized system, so they don't have to utilize pumps, decreases the energy demands in the area, and all of them will convert to sprinkle irrigation in a much more efficient manner, and they will take their natural flow water rights and they'll put those water rights in stream. 11.2 CFS of water then would be restored to that area. The entire hydrograph would go back to a more natural type of a hydrograph, in the hopes that all of those steelhead, especially that are now volitionally traveling through Opal Springs, would have a prime spawning area within the Mackay Creek lands. That would take care of all of the obstructions and the flow restrictions that are on the Mackay Creek. The first 6 miles is in OID. The next 6 miles is along this stretch that we're going to provide irrigation to, and then it takes it right to the Forest Service boundary.
All right, thank you. That was a great overview. All right, well, with that, I believe we're getting close to the end of the presentation where we can take questions, but I just want to, again, high-level overview for everyone. So the reservoirs that are in this area are, one is well over 100 years old, built in the early 1900s, Ochoco, right? And Prineville has been around since the mid-1900s, so it's getting up there as well. But their primary purpose is flood control and irrigation water, as well as now fish and wildlife. So they're asked to do a lot of different things, and they're managed as such, and it's not easy. I would say none of these guys have an easy job trying to meet all of the needs. But in general, that is how it all happens behind the scenes. So without further ado, I believe we have a few more slides.
Yeah, that's mine.
These are pretty pictures of your new pumps.
That's our pump station under construction there on the corner of Combs Flat and Laughlin. The old pump station was built in 1960, and it's now being upgraded to all new equipment and machinery. And the image on the left is the intake structure. So that's all buried under the ground now, and there's a huge intake manifold that's over 90 inches in diameter. There's inlet lines that go to these cans that are in concrete. Those are vertical can turbines. So the motors will sit on top of those black stands. And then the blue pipe is the discharge line that goes out and goes up the hill. Those of you from the area know it goes up the hill of Combs Flat up towards Barnes Butte Elementary School and hits the open canal up there at the top.
Thank
Did
you,
I
Bruce.
have another picture in there?
I don't. Nope. Oh,
I'm
nope.
good.
We're ending on the note of just saying that none of any of the things that we've talked about would be possible without a massive amount of collaboration with a ton of the people who are actually in this room right now, including the folks that are up on that screen, the City of Prineville, the Crook County Soil and Water Conservation District, the Crooked River Watershed Council, obviously Ochoco Extension, the county, it takes a village to do this kind of work. So so with that, I believe we're going to take questions, and there is going to be a mic that is going to be circulating the room. So for those of you that have questions in the room, we're going to ask that you raise your hand, and Jacob is going to come and find you with the mic. He's in the back of the room right now. But meanwhile, we also have listeners online, and so we are also going to be taking some questions online. So maybe while Jacob starts to find the first person who's going to ask an in-person question, we will take a question online, and the question relates to beavers. Having done a quick scan of the Crooked River Collaborative Water Security Act or the Crooked River Act, I found no consideration of beavers as allies in water supply and resiliency efforts. Is beaver restoration, particularly in the headwater reaches within the basin, being considered? And I think the short answer is most definitely. I know that our partners, in fact, I feel like I should be handing the mic directly to one of our partners who's sitting here in the front row to talk about the work that they are doing. Yes, they are definitely working with beavers. I think there are a lot of beaver dam analogs that are going in the system, and definitely recognizing the importance of that species for storing water, particularly in the upper reaches of the basin. So I'm looking for nodding heads. Did I? Okay, yeah. All right. I did all right with that one. Okay, so with Jacob, do you want to see a...
Working, Matt? I'm assuming it's kind of working. We're using a smaller mic than usual, which is kind of like hilariously small, holding like a Tic Tac box. But I saw a question up there, but I'm standing right next to a gentleman right here who had a question, so I'll start with you.
When you were talking about the lava beds back in the beginning, you used the term flashy. What does that mean?
You want to take that one?
Well, is this working? Okay. When I was describing the difference in soils that develop on younger versus older volcanics, when you have an impermeable older volcanic unit, such as the John Day, what I mean by flashy, I mean that from the time you have precipitation to the time you actually end up with water in the valley floor is rapid.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's flashy. Whereas in the Deschutes, you're waiting for its infiltration, right? And then all the way it's time travel, you know what I mean, based on how fast it can go through the formation, and then how fast it's issuing out of a spring. So it's a long pathway, right, in the Deschutes, whereas in the Crooked, it hits the ground and it's going downhill.
Right. So that sort of underscores the hydrograph. The hydrograph can get really high and then really low. It's kind of the flashiness of the system.
And it's how we could fill the Prineville Reservoir in 2 weeks, which is what we did in last year.
Yeah.
On a similar note, from an irrigation district operations, you may be familiar with a lot of the piping projects that are going on in the Deschutes Basin, right? And there's a whole bunch of water that's lost out of their canals through those porous materials. That's different over here on the Crooked. Not that we don't have seepage losses, but they're significantly less. I mean, if theirs are 40 to 50%, ours are like 10 to 20%, fractionally compared to what those are, just because our soils are much more clay-like.
That's a very good point. And so when you inquire about the progress of piping, that has a little bit to do with it, correct?
Yeah, definitely. It's not as much as an enormous benefit in our area. Not that we're not going to pipe certain things, but it doesn't provide the huge bang for the buck that it does on the Deschutes.
In terms of water conservation, because otherwise that water in the younger geologic area just goes right into the ground. So, yes. All right. Jacob, do you have another question for us?
Is it working? Okay. So if we look, a two-part question. First, where are we at today and where we're going to be in the future? From the standpoint of historical habitat for anadromous fish within the Crooked River. In other words, where can they get to today? Because I think there's a couple of dams in the way, as I recall. One of them's gone, but there's two in the way. So how far are they getting now, and where might they get the future?
I just use this one, Jacob.
Yeah.
Where they get now is easy. Bowman Dam is at river mile 70.5, and as Bill can attest, They get all the way up there. They don't all get up there every year, but we do have spring chinook and steelhead that move up the entirety of the Crooked and get as far as Bowman Dam. As the gentlemen were noting, Mackay Creek could potentially become increasingly suitable. And the Mackay Switch, which Reclamation and OID have made remarkable efforts on for many years, watering up that middle section at 6 miles so they can get to the forest boundary, it could be very significant and create more habitat. Ochoco Creek has not seen a lot of use. I believe the only time we saw steelhead move up into Ochoco Creek was several years ago, whenever we had, I think we had over 100 coming out of Ochoco Dam. We had a lot of flow 6-7 years ago, and we saw fish move up there.
Probably 2017. Actually.
2017.
Yeah.
So that's where we are at the moment. As for the future, all predictions about the future are, of course, tentative. There was, as part of the 2020 Habitat Conservation Plan, a study on the feasibility of fish passage at Ochoco Dam. Bowman Dam is a considerably more difficult dam to provide passage for. It's, what is it? It's 200 feet high, and Ochoco Dam is 70, something like that. And actually, the most significant problem is not getting adults over the dam, it's getting out migrants through the reservoir. Because smolts are largely dependent on water currents to help them move downstream, and reservoirs tend to be static. But it's a much shorter reservoir in Ochoco Reservoir, and it's also got Mill Creek right up at the top of the reservoir, which is potentially very good habitat. So what's going to happen in the future, I have no idea, but it is a possibility perhaps that someday there might be fish passage at Ochoco Dam, but I'm going to leave that to a younger generation of biologists to work on. I hope that answers your question, sir.
All right. So again, in the room, if you have questions, raise your hand. I'm going to take a quick, oh, no, go right ahead. I'm not going to take one online then.
Can anyone speak to what the data centers are doing now and will be doing in the future with the water situation, helping the water situation, since they use so much water? I hear, oh, they're doing this and they're doing that. What exactly are they doing, and what will they be doing in the future?
Can you take that one? Is that in your wheelhouse?
Sure. Without knowing a lot of the intricacies, somebody from the city could probably answer it a little better than I. But just in a general 30,000 foot, the data centers have a short-term, high-volume needs for water over discrete periods of time throughout, principally in the heat of the summer. It's a swamp cooler that cools them. So the demand for water is at high rates, but for a short period of time. And that's not real conducive for delivering water in a fixed pipe or something like that, or out of a restricted flows or where we have restrictions in water. What they've been doing for the several years is there's a project. It's kind of it's somewhat of a pilot project, but it's been very successful. They spent a lot of time as you go through the airport drilling holes. You saw the drill rigs on both sides of the highway, looking for what was known to be the former channel of the Crooked River that basically passes underneath those lavas at the airport. And it's a channel. It's actually, you think of it, a lot of times we picture an aquifer as being tabular. This one actually is somewhat tubular, if that makes sense. It's a channel that was buried by younger lavas, right? And they drilled to look for this channel. And they found that channel contains high pervious gravels that are readily, that will give up water if need be when needed to be pumped. So where's the water come from that they're putting into that new aquifer or that new storage area underground? Well, the water is coming from a well field that has been drilled around the perimeter of Les Schwab Park downtown near Prineville. And that series of wells, those are all on a manifold. The water is treated in the big treatment facility that they put in across the street, and then portions of it are used municipally, and portions of it are pumped back up into the aquifer. And so over the course, it's slowly filled and charged, right? And then once it's charged, or during the heat of the summer when the data centers need the water at a high rate, but for a short duration of time, they can get it out of the aquifer, and then they continue to fill it. And that's basically how it works. And part of the water that the 5,100 acre feet that the bucket of water in Prineville Reservoir is the mitigation. Portions of that is mitigation water for the water that they're pumping by the river.
Are they paying for some of this project?
That's out of my bailiwick.
All right. So we're going to take a question online real quick. How much contribution to salmonid habitat and rearing does the cold tailwater below Bowman Dam contribute?
I guess that's me.
That is you, Peter.
You don't want to take this one, Bruce. So there are 13 miles from Bowman Dam down to OID's diversion. Did I get that right? You're at about River Mile 57, Bruce? So there is 13 miles where irrigation releases, perhaps in addition with uncontracted storage releases, keep 13 miles of the Crooked well watered up through the summer. And as far as salmonid habitat goes, I think the question is probably centered mostly around steelhead and chinook. But it does provide habitat for, of course, that blue ribbon fishery there. As far as chinook and steelhead goes, if we do have fish that get up there, pair up, and spawn in that 13-mile reach, it can provide spawning habitat for spring chinook during the warmest weather months, which the basin is difficult for spring chinook in September and October when they've completed their migration and are looking for a place to spawn. It's hard to get suitable temperatures, much less flows. So there is potential for spawning and rearing there naturally. There are smolt releases of both chinook and steelhead that occur both at Mackay and Ochoco creeks. Those are in the tens of thousands of smolts. Steelhead especially are very plastic in their life history, and it is possible that some of them may simply move upstream to rear for another year inside that tailwater reach. Steelhead, and I suspect the audience is well aware of this, steelhead, Oncorhynchus micus, and rainbow trout are the same species. They're simply different life histories of the same species. And they can exhibit different life histories depending on the environmental conditions they find themselves in. So to some extent, the cold water tailwater may somewhat favor the production of more of a resident Oncorhynchus micus than an anadromous. But that's very difficult to say. It's a complex question about the habitat benefits. But they're certainly there, and they're valuable.
All right.
It's helpful.
Great. Thank you. So do you want to add something, Bruce?
Yeah, just to clarify, the reason why they're saying it's cold water is because the construction of Bowman Dam, the inlet is at the bottom of the reservoir.
Right.
So it takes water from the bottom of the reservoir is cold water that comes out of Prineville Reservoir.
Thank you for clarifying that. Okay, questions in the room, raise your hand. I'm going to take another question quickly online. Where is the funding coming from for the projects that are underway? So I'm actually just going to go ahead and answer that one. Bruce talked about the PL 566, which is the Watershed Protection and Flood Prevention Program, which is a natural resources conservation program. So that's NRCS, which is U.S. Department of Agriculture, and They are funding a good chunk of the projects, along with the Oregon Water Resources Department, which is also helping with state funding. So it's both federal and state funding that is funding the projects that Bruce described, including the Mackay Switch project. So,
And including portions of the ASR project.
the ASR is the Aquifer Storage and Recharge Project. So, oh yeah, OWEB and Pelton are all. OWEB is the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, and Pelton, the Brown Butte facility, is also helping to fund the projects as well. Did I leave anyone else out? Okay. All right. Any other questions in the room? There's one back there, and I see one more. Let's see. Okay. Here we go.
Yes, I had a question about, I understood that the valley here is a cirque of the Crooked River caldera, where the northern edge was Smith Rocks area. And I was wondering if there's any studies of just the aquifer within the valley area. And the reason I'm wondering about that is in the last 25 years, since the construction of the wetlands, just south of Pine, or let's see, that would be northwest of Prineville, and with Facebook going in and all the water stuff going on, my personal well has dropped 65 feet. The static level of the well has dropped 65 feet just within the valley floor, and I live on the south side, on the other side of the wetlands. So I'm concerned about the water in the aquifer right here in the basin, and I haven't heard anybody mention anything about any studies about that.
Is that something you can take? Groundwater.
Actually, that's not my bailiwick. But depending, there's lots of variables about how deep your well is, where and what units are in. And there's a huge difference actually just in the type of aquifer within the valley. Globally, you have river gravels and alluvium, and then if you're just up the slope, you could be in the John Day, or you could in fact be in Deschutes Formation. So there's lots of different varying units, rock units, aquifer units, that have different capacities of delivering water. And when one real quick thing, and I had a conversation with somebody earlier today, but the John Day Formation, and if your well is in the John Day Formation, it is notorious for a couple things. One, it's notorious for being difficult to find groundwater in, because the groundwater is not, the aquifers are not in a nice, beautiful bathtub tabular form like they are in the Deschutes Basin. The aquifers in the John Day Basin are discontinuous, meaning they're not connected to each other, and sometimes they may not even be connected to the surface of the ground. So the water that's actually in the ground is actually really old water, and you could be tapping into a small little aquifer in a very brittle rock that has a limited amount of water to begin with and may not be connected to your neighbor's well. So it's really difficult to quantify groundwater flow in the John Day Formation, and it's orders of magnitude more difficult than it would be in the Deschutes Basin. The Deschutes Basin is pretty simple with regards to groundwater flow. We can predict what the drawdowns are roughly within a couple feet per, a couple inches, 3 or 4 inches per year in most of the basin in the Deschutes, whereas in Prineville and the Crooked Basin, that's not the case. So it's a very complicated question, and I can refer you to some groundwater folks at the department, and they'd be happy to see if they can further answer your question for you, for sure.
Thank you. All right, I think there are 2 more in the back of the room.
Couple of questions. Number one, the way I understand it, there's a lot of nitrates. It's either nitrates or nitrites in fertilizer. And I was wondering if the runoff from the farmers and ranchers' fields upstream from the Bowman Dam has a negative effect on the wildlife and fish all the way down. And second part of that is I moved over here about 6 years ago, and it seems to me that since then there's been a really big increase in the number of weeds in the Crooked River, and I don't know about anybody else, but I'd rather catch a fish than a weed. You know, they fight a lot better.
All right, a water quality question. I don't know, Bruce, can you take that one?
You're not going to get the best answer from me. I'll throw some things out there. So you talked about above the reservoir and use of fertilizers above Prineville Reservoir. The reservoir itself acts as like a nitrate sink, and so it will absorb it. The nitrate. The samples that have been done right below Bowman Dam are very low in nitrates. So, and when you're talking about things like aquatic weeds, part of that is a factor that, especially over the previous 3 years, without any significant flows out of Bowman Dam during the drought, there was a ton of growth. When we ramped up to 3,000 CFS last winter because of flood control, it helped to get a start on fleshing some of that out. But it did create a foothold for a lot of invasive weeds and different things that we haven't seen before. And we get the joy of having them in our canal now, and they're growing and wreaking havoc in our system. So yeah, we feel your pain, and I don't like to fish for weeds either.
Wait, hold on just 1 second. Let's get the mic only because of the people at home.
Do those nitrates in that sink you're talking about get into the fish at all by them eating anything at all?
Not that I know of. I think that they more get absorbed or processed through the vegetation, algae, and things that use them and grow with it. There's a really concerted effort, just on a side note, with the partners within the Crooked River area, the Soil and Water Conservation District, the Crooked River Watershed Council, the county, the city of Prineville, OID, our partners with the DRC, Trout Unlimited, and others, are doing a whole lot of studies. USGS now too, and Hank. So we're doing a lot of work on specifically nitrates within the area, trying to do some isotope studies here in the coming weeks, months, and then we're going to. And we're also finding that there's a difference between the concentration of nitrates in the water and the load of nitrates that are in the water. And so if it has a high concentration but a very little quantity of water, which most of the Crooked River actually doesn't have huge volumes, then there's a percentage of nitrates that's there. But if we look at things like the Opal Springs amount of water that comes in the spring reach of 1,000 plus CFS at different times, even though there's a small percentage of nitrates, the actual load that's coming out of the springs is what's contributing to the greatest quantity of nitrates that are coming into Lake Billy Chinook. So we're trying to better understand what those contributions are, where those things are coming from, what the sources of those are, so that we can get the greatest bang for the buck to deal with those water quality issues that are known within the Crooked River, that we all care about our river and our stream, and we're trying to get a plan together to how to deal with those.
So stay tuned. All right, I think there was one more question. Hands up for questions. Oh. All right, while you make your way over there, I'm going to read a quick one online here. Is there a minimum flow requirement for fish and wildlife throughout the year on the Crooked River?
Sounds like me. Yes.
All right.
But I'll elaborate. In the 1956 legislation that constructed Bowman Dam, there is language that says, and I do not have this committed to memory, but basically that reclamation, Greg, fix this if I mess it up, basically the reclamation will release a minimum flow of 10 CFS from Bowman Dam when no other flow releases are being made. So if there's an irrigation release being made and it exceeds 10 CFS, that meets the 10 CFS minimum. The quandary we ended up with in fall of 2022, as you remember, we had zero uncontracted storage for fish and wildlife and only a very limited amount of water in the mitigation account. And we actually ran up against this wall of a 10 CFS minimum. And without going into detail, it created an extremely novel situation in which Greg, who's right here, can explain how, if I am phrasing this correctly, they created a bit of a 10 CFS storage account in order to maintain the 10 CFS, because we certainly didn't have inflows. So anything you want to add to that, Greg, in terms of the 10 CFS minimum flow?
Yeah, I think you handled that pretty well. That's a nutshell.
All
Okay.
right, for those of you online, Greg said that's it in a nutshell. So-
And I will say, if I could, that 10 that they budgeted for, was essentially part of the original allocation that came at the start of the irrigation season, where those first fill buckets were equally reduced to contribute towards that minimum flow. So it came out of first fill accounts before the allocation of their water for the year happened, so that they would know how much water. In addition, evaporation was taken into consideration, sedimentation there was a whole bunch of complicated elements that went into that determination.
Suffice it to say that the Crooked got down to 10 CFS coming out of Bowman Dam. And there are a variety of reports available and information available as to how that affected the fishery until you get down to Mackay and Ochoco and their inflows available to those who are interested. I do have to add one more minimum flow. The 2020 HCP, which we worked out with all the districts, established a 50 CFS minimum flow during the storage season, reaching approximately from October 15th to April 15th. So there is the 10 CFS minimum flow that is also present in the Crooked, reiterated in the Crooked River Act, and then the 50 CFS minimum flow during the winter months that is supported by OID in conjunction with water we reserve up to 13,000 acre feet from the uncontracted storage to maintain a 50 CFS minimum October 15th to April 15th from Bowman Dam down.
All right.
So 2 minimum flows.
What?
And the minimum flows downstream in North Unit pumps, which are embodied in the DRC North Unit water supply agreement, and which were also incorporated into Crooked River Conservation Measure CR7, and which we sort of belt and suspended those flows.
So there are 3.
which is principally why we're putting a new gauge above the Crooked River pumps so that we can audit those the withdrawal and audit the in-stream.
All right. Well, with that, I think we have unfortunately. Well, is there time for one more question? Okay, one more question in the back.
Oh, it's more than one question. So I'm just you talked about the flow during the drought, that it got down to 10 CFS for the release. I wonder what the river flow into the reservoir was at the same time.
I'm going to go with 0 on that.
Yep.
So the reservoir provides, many times we can go to Post and look at river flow into the reservoir, and thank God that the reservoir exists, because during the summer months you're letting 200 plus CFS come out of that reservoir, and there's less than 10 going into it many times at Post. So I'll try to be quick. You know me, I'm not. Bruce, OID doesn't take near the credit they should for post-1998 flood restoration activities in the city of Prineville. OID did significant improvements to its delivery system, making it almost completely fish-friendly with its diversions in Ochoco Creek and Mackay Creek, changing those structures so 100% fish bypass. You guys hardly ever pat yourself on the back for that effort. And many people in here don't remember the 1998 flood for some reason, but it was a big one.
It was nasty.
The question I have on the Mackay Exchange, lots of promises made about this 11 CFS. Well, Mackay doesn't flow 11 CFS for very long coming out of the Ochoco Mountains or up Mackay. So I'm curious, pre-switch, what kind of monitoring of flows is being done in Mackay Creek above any diversion point, and then kind of what's coming out below it, so we sort of have a before and after, because many of us sort of think there's an awful lot of things being promised that aren't going to be realized with that switch. It's great for the landowners; they're going to get season-long water. But I think the poor fish is going to come out a little on the short side.
The gentleman who's going to answer that question, I believe, is standing right next to you.
Yep.
Yeah, so if you would like to know what kind of monitoring we're doing, so we have 5 sites along Mackay Creek, well, 4 sites along Mackay Creek, 1 on Ochoco Creek where it meets the Crooked River. I won't give specifics exactly where those sites are, but they're on that 6-mile stretch that Bruce mentioned where the Mackay switch will occur. We monitor for surface flow, temperature, depth, pretty much any water quality measure you can imagine in terms of fish habitat. So right now, as you mentioned, the switch has not been implemented. And as you mentioned, no matter what, the river will go dry midsummer, no matter what. The snow melts off and there's no longer water flowing in. But during that period in the early summer and early spring is the large goal of the Mackay switch, right? So after this is implemented, there will be flow throughout that period of time when the fish want to go up that creek. And so we have those monitoring sites located in specific spots where we want to know if there's enough flow, if the temperature has gone low enough to make sure that those fish can, survive in that habitat. Until the switch gets implemented, we can only say so much about, what exactly is going to occur. But, studies have been conducted that would show that after this 11.2 CFS is restored, in addition to any return flows that occur because of the switch and the OID water coming out of Prineville Reservoir, will enhance that flow and the temperature enough to support that habitat for the fish. And I'm not sure if Bruce, Peter, or Bill want to say anything more.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think that you don't know what you don't know. The hope is there that we can restore that hydrograph in the area, not only leaving the water in stream that's coming down naturally, but also taking water out of Prineville Reservoir and sprinkling it on the ground will add something to that system as well. The reality, however, is that what the steelhead need is year-round water. I'll let the expert talk about that, and that's not going to happen. That's not the idea, is that there's going to be water there all the time, but will it become closer to what historically it was supposed to be? I think that's the goal.
Yep.
That's the goal that I have, at least.
And last point, the water that comes into that system, we know we have a measurement, we have a gauge at the Forest Service boundary at the head of the system, and we also will have a gauge at the bottom of the system. So obviously there won't be 11 CFS there year round. We know it dries up, but what water comes into that system in the new project, we will measure and verify that it comes out of the system. That's what Water Resources is going to do, part of the project, and that's in addition to numerous other monitoring points along that drainage to verify that the flows are there.
All right. I do see another hand, but we have reached time, so I am going to thank you all. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. I'm going to thank you all for coming and being a very wonderful audience that stuck it out through all of that wonderful information. And if you do have other questions, please let us know. We will be here. If we can't answer them tonight, we'll make sure that they get answered. Thank you all for coming and for making our first Raise the Deschutes in Prineville a success. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, you guys.